On the morning of July 14th, 1996, Bud Fenner wrote a wheat ticket at the Kiowa elevator and then looked at the number and checked his arithmetic. He checked it again. He had been writing wheat tickets in Kiowa, Kansas for 29 years, which meant he had seen most of the numbers that Pratt County ground could produce, and the number on the slip in front of him was not a number he recognized from that experience. He walked to the door of the scale house and looked at the combine sitting on the scale. It was a John Deere 9,500, 3 years old, green paint still holding its color in the July morning light. The woman who had driven it in was already pulling around to the receiving pit. He looked at the number again. 68 bushels per acre on hard red winter wheat in Pratt County, Kansas, in the summer of 1996. He would spend the rest of that morning asking every farmer who came through what their fields were running. None of them were above 58. Most were in the low to mid-50s. He did the math on the back of a ticket stub, and the math said what it said, which was that the woman running the 400-acre Voss place in the north part of the county, County, had produced a number that did not fit inside the county's recent history. That woman was Vera Voss. She was 38 years old. She had been running the farm alone for 14 months. And the story of how she came to be standing in a wheat field in Pratt County on a July morning with 68 bushels per acre behind her starts not in 1996, but in 1971 in Stafford County, 2 counties east, where a farmer named Harlan Greer had begun doing something with his wheat ground that no one around him was doing yet, and that most of them did not understand when he tried to explain it. Pratt County sits in the south-central part of Kansas, where the land runs flat and open in the particular way of the wheat belt section. Line roads cutting the country into quarter-section squares. The sky dominant from October through July. A person driving the county roads able to see a combine, working a mile away, and read the dust and the swath width, and form a rough opinion of how the crop was running. The Voss farm sat on 400 acres in the north part of the county, with the north field running along the county road and the west quarter dropping slightly toward a draw that held moisture through dry stretches better than the ground on either side. Dean Voss had farmed it with steady competence for 13 years before his heart stopped on a May morning in 1995, and left Vera with the land, the equipment, 2 children in middle school, a note at the Farm Credit Office in Pratt for $67,000, and the collected opinions of everyone in 3 counties about whether she could manage it. The opinions arrived in various forms. The Farm Credit Loan Officer, who had written the original note, retired the same week Dean died, which meant that his replacement, a man named Gerald Moss, who had been moved up from the Hutchinson office to handle the Pratt County portfolio, made his first call to the Voss farm in June of 1995, while Vera was still sorting through Dean's equipment files in the barn. Gerald was 47 years old and had a system for evaluating agricultural risk that he had developed over 20 years in farm lending, and the variables he was looking at on the Voss account in June of 1995 told him a consistent story. Widow, age 38, 2 dependents, note of $67,000, no farm management credentials on record. He drove out to the farm on a Wednesday afternoon, parked in the yard, and sat across from Vera at the kitchen table with his portfolio open and his pen uncapped. He went through the account history. He reviewed the note terms. He described the bank's position, which was careful, and which said between the lines what it was not quite saying directly, which was that there were options if the operation was more than she could handle. He said those words at the end. Options if the operation is more than you can handle. And then he said the other thing, which was the thing Vera remembered when she thought about that afternoon. He said there was no shame in an orderly exit. He used the words exit gracefully. Vera looked at him across the kitchen table. She did not raise her voice. She did not explain herself. She stood up, closed her own folder, and walked to the door and opened it and stood beside it until Gerald Moss understood that the meeting was finished. He drove back down the lane, and she watched his car turn onto the county road and disappear toward Pratt. And then she went back to the barn and finished sorting the equipment files. Harlan Greer arrived 2 days later in his 1988 Ford pickup with a canvas duffel bag in the bed and the look of a man who has decided something and is not going to discuss whether he decided it. He was 67 years old and had farmed 640 acres in Stafford County for 4 decades, with the particular stubbornness of a man who trusted what he observed over what he was told. He had driven the 2 counties east on a Tuesday morning, and he was not going back until he had done what he came to do, which he had not told Vera, because telling her in advance would have given her the opportunity to tell him it was not necessary. He was her father. He had taught her to farm in the way that farm fathers teach the children who are paying attention, not with a curriculum, but with proximity, with the gradual transfer of decisions to the person who demonstrates the judgment to carry them. He had given Vera the spray decision on the winter wheat when she was 15. He had let her run the fertilizer rate calculations at 17. By the time she graduated and married Dean Voss in 1980 and moved to the Pratt County farm, she had been making most of the in-season management decisions on the Greer operation for 2 years, with Harlan reviewing and occasionally revising, and the revisions had been getting rarer each season. What Harlan had put into her was not just the practice. It was the record. He had started doing something in 1971 that was new enough to the county that the extension agent had to explain to him how to submit the samples. Tissue testing. The principle was this: wheat growing in a field is telling you what it needs if you have a way to listen to it, and a tissue test is that way. You cut a sample of leaf material at a specific growth stage, mail it to a laboratory, and receive back a chemical analysis that shows you the exact nutrient status of the plant at that moment. Not what the soil has available in theory, what the plant has actually taken up. The difference between those 2 numbers is where most of the yield is left in the field. Harlan had been doing this every April since 1971. He had used the results to adjust his in-season nitrogen and micronutrient applications based on what the plant actually needed, rather than what a calendar schedule said it probably needed. Most of his neighbors had not bothered with it because the bother was real and the benefit was not immediately visible until you looked at the yield maps over time, and most of his neighbors did not keep yield maps. Harlan did. Every year on a hand-drawn grid in a 3-ring binder with a green cover, field by field, 1 page per year. The binders were in the duffel bag in the back of his truck. He carried them into the kitchen and set them on the table without ceremony. 25 years of yield data in Stafford County, the years arranged in columns on each field, paid the management notes in his pencil hand, in the margins, the tissue test results clipped to the inside back cover of each binder. He sat down and opened the 1971 volume and pointed at the first page, which showed the north quarter of his home place and the yield that year, and the note in the margin that read, First Tissue Test. April 14th, adjusted N by 12 pounds per acre flag, leaves showed response by first week of May. Vera sat across from him and looked at the page. She had grown up with these binders the way other children grow up with family photograph albums. Something present and familiar, whose full weight you do not understand until you are old enough to read what is in them. She said, these go back further than mine. Harlan said, yours go back to 86. Mine go back to 71. Between the 2 of us, we have 30 years of this ground in 2 counties. Vera looked at the binders stacked on the table. Then she looked at her own binder, which was on the counter where she had been working through it that morning. 10 years of Pratt County yield data in Dean's hand for the first 4 years and hers for the last 6. She said, did Dean ever talk to you about the loan? Harlan looked at the table, He was quiet for a moment, which was not like him. He was a man who answered questions directly. He said yes. She said when. He said before he got sick. He was thinking about selling the West, 120 to cover it. He called me in the winter and asked what I thought. Vera waited. Harlan said I told him not to sell, that the West Quarter is the moisture-holding ground, and without it, the yield consistency drops. I told him the loan was manageable on the farm's income if the management was right. Vera said, and he didn't sell. Harlan said he didn't sell. The kitchen was quiet for a long time. Through the window above the sink, the north field was visible in the afternoon light. The wheat still 3 weeks from heading the stand, even in dark green in the way that tells a person who knows wheat that the season is building toward something. She had planted it herself in October, 5 months after Dean's funeral, with Pete Schiller running the drill and Danny riding along on weekends to help with the logistics and record keeping, because at 14 she had already absorbed enough of the farm's routines to be genuinely useful. Vera looked at the north field through the window. Then she looked at the binders. She said, "Where's the 71 binder from your South Quarter?" Harlan reached across and pulled it from the stack and opened it to the first page and slid it across to her. She read it. She did not read it the way you read something for the first time. She read it the way you read something you already half know, filling in the gaps in what you understood before. After a while, she said, "This is the same field logic I've been using on the West Quarter here. Same adjustment principle. I didn't know you'd written it out like this." Harlan said, "I didn't write it out so you would copy it. I wrote it so there would be a record of what worked and what didn't. The decision still has to be made fresh each year." She closed the binder. She looked at her father. Harlan Greer was 67 years old and had been paying attention to the same ground since before the County Extension Service had tissue testing protocols, and the accumulation of that attention was sitting on her kitchen table in green binders that she now understood had always been intended for exactly this moment. She said, "I need to show you the West Quarter soil maps." Harlan said, "I've been waiting for you to offer since I walked in." Curtis Plank came by on a Saturday morning in August, the third time he had come by since Dean's funeral. He was 58 years old and farmed the section to the east of the Voss place, and he had the particular directness of a man who has decided that his interest in a piece of property is not something he needs to disguise. He parked his truck at the equipment shed where Vera was going over the spray records with Pete, and walked over with his hands in his pockets and the same expression he had worn on the previous 2 visits. He said he wanted to make sure Vera knew that his offer on the West 120 was still open. Vera did not look up from the records. She said, "I know it's open, Curtis." He said the market for that ground was soft right now, but it was not going to get better, and a cash sale would clear the farm credit note with room left over and leave her with a manageable operation on the remaining 280. Vera set the spray record down. She looked at him. She said Dean didn't sell it when he was here, and I'm not going to sell it now that he's not. Curtis looked at her for a moment. He said, "Dean talked to me about it more than once." She said, "I know what Dean talked to you about." He looked past her at the north field, which was visible from the equipment shed. He stood there a moment longer. Then he said the offer stands and walked back to his truck and drove down the lane. Pete watched the truck until it turned onto the road. He said, "He's been out to see me twice." Vera looked at him. Pete said, "Came to the house. Said if the situation here changed, he'd have work for me on the West 120 at a better rate than he assumed I was getting here." Vera was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And Pete said I told him the situation here wasn't going to change. And then I came to tell you." She looked at Pete Schiller, who was 52 years old and had been on the Voss place since 1990, and who had, as far as she had ever seen, said exactly what he meant and done exactly what he said. She said, "Thank you." Pete picked up the spray record and went back to work. The planting in October of 1995 went in under a cold, clear sky with the soil temperature at exactly the level that Harlan's records indicated was optimal for the variety Vera had selected. The variety was a hard red winter wheat called Jagger, which the Kansas State variety trial data showed had a yield advantage in her specific soil type and disease environment. She had spent 3 evenings in August going through the trial data against her own field history, field by field, comparing the variety's performance in conditions that matched her ground. She had pulled the variety selection notes from Dean's earlier years, which were in his hand in the margins of the binder pages, and had seen that he had been thinking along the same lines in the last 2 years before he died. She calibrated the seeding rate by field lower on the heavy ground in the north field that historically produced dense stands, and higher on the west quarter where the soil ran lighter and tiller survival was lower. She applied the pre-plant fertilizer based on soil tests she had run in August, sending the samples in the labeled brown paper bags she kept in a box on the barn shelf, and she scheduled the top dress nitrogen application for late February before dormancy break, which was when Harlan's records showed the highest nitrogen use efficiency. Harlan stayed through the planting. He was still there in November, and by December it was clear that he was not going back to Stafford County until the crop came off. He had called a neighbor in Stafford to check on his own place, and he had told Vera's mother that he would be back by spring, which was not true, and which Iris Greer understood was not true, and which she accepted because she knew her husband, and she knew her daughter, and she understood what was happening on the Voss farm in the winter of 1995 into 1996, well enough to know it required him. The first hard piece of news in December came from the equipment shed. The John Deere 444 threw a hydraulic line on a Wednesday morning when Pete was moving it to the west quarter for the cover crop work, and the line had taken the pump fitting with it when it went, which meant the repair was not a field fix. The estimate from the implement dealer in Pratt was $3,200, which was not in the operating budget for December. Curtis Plank was at the elevator in Kiowa when Pete picked up a part for the other tractor that same afternoon. He stopped Pete in the lot and asked if he had heard about the 444. Oh, Pete said yes. Curtis said he had a standing offer to buy the 444 if Vera wanted to sell it, which would cover the repair cost on the 5140 and leave cash in the account, because there was no point running 2 tractors if you were running a downsized operation. Pete came back to the farm and told Vera. She listened. She said, "How does he know about the 4440? Pete said, "Small county." Vera was quiet for a moment. Then she went to the barn and looked at the broken tractor, and then she went to the house and called the implement dealer back and told him to order the parts. She sold the 3 remaining Angus cows she had been holding since the summer, which covered the repair bill, and left enough to carry the operating account through February. Harlan came in from checking the south field that evening and saw the look on her face and sat down at the table and did not say anything for a while. Then he said, "The 444 is fixed." She said, "It will be." He said, "Good." That was all he said about it, which was the right amount. The winter moved through in the way of Kansas winters, cold and opened the wheat dormant under the gray sky, and the county roads empty in the mornings except for the trucks of the men who had animals to tend. Vera walked the fields every 2 weeks in her rubber boots with the soil thermometer and the notebook, checking the stands, reading the color at the soil line, making the entries in the binder that she would compare against Harlan's records for the same growth stage in similar years. Harlan went out alone sometimes in the early mornings before she was up. Pete saw him once from the equipment shed, standing at the far end of the north field in the gray light before sunrise, crouched down with something in his hand looking at the ground. Pete did not walk out to him. He understood what he was looking at and what it meant. A man who had been reading wheat ground for 40 years does not need an audience. On a morning in February, Harlan called the neighbor checking his Stafford County ground and told him he would not be back before May. He did not tell Vera he had made the call. She found out 3 weeks later when her mother mentioned it in passing on the phone, and she did not bring it up with him because there was nothing to say about it that would add to what had already been said by the fact of his staying. The top-dress nitrogen went on in the last week of February. Pete ran the spreader truck in the early morning, while Vera stood at the field end with the portable radio tuned to the weather station out of Pratt, watching the sky to the north and west where the rain was supposed to come from. The forecast said rain by afternoon. She had timed the application to move the nitrogen into the soil before the plant broke dormancy, which was the same timing Harlan had used in Stafford County since 1978, and which his yield records showed consistently outperforming applications made 2 weeks later. The rain came in the afternoon, steady and cold, moving the nitrogen down into the root zone before dark. Vera stood at the kitchen window and watched it. Harlan sat at the table behind her, with the binder open, not reading it, just sitting with it open the way a man sits with a book he has read many times and no longer needs to look at to know what it says. Gerald Moss called the following week. He was professional and precise. He said the bank needed to schedule a review of the account before the end of the second quarter. He mentioned the option of a pre-harvest restructuring agreement, which he said the bank could offer at favorable terms given the current land values in the county. He said the appraisal the bank used for the West 120 acreage, which was the collateral security for the original note, had been updated using the most recent comparable sales data for the county. Vera wrote down the words pre-harvest restructuring. She said she would wait until she had the harvest numbers before she discussed any restructuring. Gerald said the bank's preference was to have the agreement in place before harvest, rather than contingent on it. She said she understood his preference. She said she would call him after harvest. She hung up the phone and sat at the table and looked at the binder, and then looked out at the north field where the wheat had broken dormancy in the past week and was beginning the push toward spring growth that would tell her by May whether the season was setting up right. The stand was even, and the tiller count was where she needed it, and the tissue test she had sent in the week before had come back with numbers that matched Harlan's best years in Stafford County. Harlan came in from outside and set his coat on the hook and sat across from her. He looked at her expression. He said, "What did the bank want?" She told him. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Are you going to sign it?" She said no. He looked at her. He said, "If the season doesn't come in." She said, "The season is going to come in." He looked at the binder. He said, "Yes, it is." She looked at the table. Then she said, "The bank's appraisal on the West 120 uses county average yield data, not the yield history of this specific farm." Harlan looked at her. She said the county average for this ground class over the past 10 years runs about 48 to 52 bushels. Our yield history on the West quarter over the same period runs 60 to 64. If an appraiser used the farm's actual documented productivity instead of the county average, the per acre value on that ground comes out 40% higher than the bank's number. Harlan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "That's what the binder is for." She said, "I know. I just wanted to say it out loud." He said, "Say it to Gerald Moss." She said, "I intend to." Outside, the wheat on the north field was visible in the late afternoon light, the new growth showing green above the soil line in the even rows that tell a person who has been reading wheat ground long enough to know what even rows mean. 40 years of tissue testing and variable nitrogen rates and careful variety selection and 3-ring binders full of yield maps had been building toward this field in this county, in this season since before Vera Voss knew what a yield map was. She closed the binder. She stood up. She went out to walk the north field before the light was gone, the way she had gone out every evening since October, reading the crop, the way Harlan had taught her to read it, the same way his father had walked his ground before him, counting what was there and measuring it against what the record said it should be. The wheat did not know about Gerald Moss or Curtis Plank or the $67,000 note or the 14 months since Dean had died on a May morning in the field he had farmed for 13 years. It only knew the soil temperature and the nitrogen level and the moisture in the root zone, and what all three of those things were saying in the particular language of a Kansas wheat field in late February was that the season was setting up right. The wheat broke dormancy in the first week of March with the kind of even vigorous push that tells a person who has been watching Kansas ground long enough that the season is not just starting right, but intending to finish that way. Vera walked the north field on a Thursday morning with the tiller count notebook and came back with numbers that matched the best early season entry in Harlan's Stafford County binder from 1988, which had been his highest yielding year on record before 1994. She wrote the numbers in her own binder without comment. Harlan read them over her shoulder without comment. That was the only conversation they needed about it. Gerald Moss's letter arrived on a Friday in the third week of March, delivered by certified mail in an envelope, with the First Agricultural Bank of Pratt County return address printed in the upper left corner. Vera picked it up at the rural box at the end of the lane on her way back from the north field, her boots still carrying the morning mud, and she opened it, standing at the box rather than waiting until she got to the house. The letter was 4 pages. The first page reviewed the account history and the terms of the original note. The second page described the bank's pre-harvest restructuring program, which Gerald had mentioned on the phone, and laid out the terms in the language of bank documents, which was precise, in the way that bank documents are precise when the precision is designed to move you toward a conclusion you might not reach on your own. The third page contained the appraisal summary for the West 120 acres, which the bank had commissioned, using comparable sales data for the county, for the previous 36 months. The appraised value per acre was listed at the bottom of the third page. Vera read that number twice. Then she folded the letter and put it in her jacket pocket and walked back to the house. Harlan was at the kitchen table with his coffee. He looked at her when she came in. She set the letter on the table and sat across from him. She said they used the county average productivity data for the appraisal. Harlan picked up the letter and read the appraisal page. He read it slowly. He set it down. She said, "Per acre value on the West 120. Comes out 18% below what I'd put it at, using our yield history." Harlan looked at the letter. Then he looked at her binder on the counter. Then he looked at his own binders, stacked on the shelf beside it. She said the restructuring agreement they want me to sign uses that appraised value as the collateral baseline. If I sign it and the crop doesn't perform, the bank's recovery position on the West 120 is based on their number, not the ground's actual productivity history, Harlan said. And if you don't sign it, she said, then I go to harvest without an agreement in place, and the bank has to wait for the numbers like everyone else. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the March wind was moving across the north field in the way it moves across Kansas wheat ground in early spring, bending the new growth without breaking it, which is the particular quality of young wheat that has rooted deep enough to hold against what the sky sends. Harlan said, "What does Gerald say happens if you don't sign before harvest?" She said he says the bank will need to pursue its options regarding the collateral. Harlan looked at the letter one more time. He said, how many bushels does the West Quarter need to run to service the note on its own earnings? She had already done the arithmetic. She said 58 would cover it with margin. The 10-year average on that ground in our binder is 61.4. Harlan said, "Sign nothing." She said, "That's what I thought." She picked up the letter and drove to Pratt that same afternoon and sat across from Gerald Moss in his office with the letter on his desk between them and her own binder open to the West Quarter. Yield history, the 10 years of data, in 2 different handwritings, Dean's and hers. Gerald looked at the binder. He was a careful man, and he looked at it the way careful men look at things that do not fit inside the framework they have been using. He looked at the column of yield numbers, the years running across the top, and the field sections running down the left margin, and he looked at the 10-year average at the bottom of the west quarter column, which was 61.4 bushels per acre. He said, "This is your operational record." She said, "It's the farm's operational record going back to 86. My father's records from Stafford County go back to 71. They're at the house if you want to see what 25 years of this management approach produces over time." Gerald looked at the yield average again. He said, "Our appraisal methodology uses county comparable data as the standard basis." She said, "I understand that. I'm showing you that the standard basis undercounts the productivity of this specific ground by a significant margin. The appraisal is using the county's average management history to value a farm that has been managed above county average for 10 years. Those are different things." Gerald closed the letter and looked at her. He said, "Mrs. Voss, if you don't sign the restructuring agreement before harvest, the bank is in a difficult position if the crop doesn't perform as expected." She said, "The bank's position before harvest and after harvest is the same land with the same yield history. The only thing that changes between now and July is whether you have the actual numbers to work with instead of the county average." She closed the binder and stood up. She said, "I'll have the yield data to you within a week of the last load coming off. If the numbers don't support the note, we can talk about the bank's options then." She picked up the binder and walked out of his office and out of the Farm Credit Building into the March afternoon and drove back to the farm on the county roads that ran straight through wheat ground that was beginning to show the particular shade of green that means a crop is moving into the rapid growth phase of early spring. She did not know what the yield was going to be. She knew the yield history. She knew the management. She knew what the tissue tests had shown and what the nitrogen timing had looked like and what the stand counts told her about the tiller density going into the flag leaf stage. She knew all of that. But the number itself, the actual bushels per acre, that the combine auger was going to move across the scale at Bud Fenner's elevator in July, was still 4 months out and still contingent on the weather between now and then in ways that no binder could account for. She drove the county road with both hands on the wheel and let herself hold that fact for the duration of the drive home. 4 months. The West 120 and the North Field and the Northwest corner, and all 400 acres of the Voss place depending on a Kansas spring to behave in the range of what the record said it had behaved like before. When she pulled into the yard, Danny was on the porch with her own notebook, the small spiral one she used for the field observation entries she had been making since October. Danny was 14 years old and had grown up on this farm the way Vera had grown up in Stafford County by proximity and repetition, and the gradual understanding that the decisions being made around her were serious ones being made by people who knew what they were doing. She had been recording stand counts and making margin notes since October in a handwriting that was starting to look in its precision and its brevity like Vera's own. Vera got out of the truck and came up to the porch. Danny looked at her face and said, "What did the bank say?" Vera said the bank said what banks say when they want something. I said what I needed to say. Danny said, "Did you bring the binder?" Vera said, "Yes." Danny said, "Good. That's what I would have done." Vera looked at her daughter for a moment. Danny had Dean's eyes and Harlan's way of going directly to the thing without circling it. And both of those qualities had been producing a combination in the past 14 months that Vera had not anticipated, and that she was grateful for in the specific way you are grateful for things you did not know you needed. She went inside and put the binder on the table and started supper. Cody came in from the equipment shed, where he had been helping Pete run the preseason check on the 9,500, which was the combine that would run the harvest in July. and he had the particular look of a 12-year-old who has been doing something mechanical and found it satisfying. He sat down and ate without asking about the bank or the letter, or any of the things that were sitting in the room with the same weight as the binder on the table. Because at 12 he understood that some of the weight in a room is not his to pick up yet. Harlan said grace. It was short the way his graces always were, and it did not ask for anything specific, which was the way Vera had always understood his relationship with what he was asking. He was a man who prayed in the same way he observed a field, paying attention, not demanding, waiting to see what was actually there. April came in cold and then turned warm in the second week. The wheat entering the jointing stage with the kind of uniformity that shows up in the stand counts as almost no variance between the row samples, which meant the seeding rate calibration in October had been right for the conditions that developed. Vera took the tissue samples herself in the third week of April, cutting the leaf material with the pocket knife she kept in her jacket, dropping the samples into the labeled brown paper bags she had prepared the week before sealing them, and writing the field code and the date, and the growth stage on the outside in the permanent marker she kept in the same pocket as the knife. She boxed them that evening and drove them to the post office in Kiowa the following morning. The results came back 10 days later, and she read them at the kitchen table with Harlan sitting across from her and the field maps spread between them. The nitrogen status on the north field and the west quarter was within the range that Harlan's records identified as the optimal zone for yield development at this growth stage. The micronutrient levels on the northwest corner, which was the sandier ground she had seeded at the higher rate, showed a slight sulfur deficiency that was within the correctable range if she addressed it before flag leaf emergence. She called the co-op that afternoon and ordered the sulfur application. Pete ran the sprayer on the northwest corner. 2 days later, in the early morning, before the wind came up and Vera walked ahead of the sprayer, checking the spray pattern at the nozzles the way she had been taught to do in Stafford County. Not assuming the equipment was running right, but checking it, because the records showed you what happened when you assumed. Curtis Plank was at the co-op when she picked up the spray invoice. He was talking to 2 other farmers at the counter when she came in, and he nodded at her, in the way people nod when they have said what they had to say, and are waiting to see what the silence produces. She picked up the invoice and paid it, and left without stopping at the counter, and she heard the conversation resume behind her as she went through the door. The disease scouting started in early May. Vera walked the fields every 2 weeks with the clipboard checking for the particular combination of conditions that Harlan called the triangle. The interaction of host susceptibility and pathogen pressure and weather environment that determines whether a fungal disease takes hold or moves through without leaving a mark. The Jagger variety she had planted had a moderate susceptibility rating for stripe rust, which meant she was watching the temperature data carefully through May because the weather window that favored stripe rust development was a specific one, and the application timing for the fungicide had to fall inside the flag leaf to heading interval to protect the grain fill period. Walt, Deering the Pratt County Extension agent, drove out on a Thursday in the second week of May to look at a neighbor's field and stopped at the Voss place on his way back. He was 44 years old and had been in the county since 1990 and had a reputation for looking at crops without editorializing, which meant that when he said something about a field, it meant something. He got out of his truck and walked with Vera to the north field and stood at the edge of the stand for a while and looked at it without speaking. He crouched down and looked at the base of a plant, and then looked at the flag leaf, and then stood up and looked at the stand across the field. He said, "Tissue tests." Vera said April 3rd, results in 10 days. Adjusted the northwest corner sulfur in the third week. He nodded. He wrote something in his notepad. He said, "Fungicide timing." She said, "I'm watching the stripe rust triangle. Temperature window looks like it could open in the next 2 weeks." I'm planning to run the application at early heading if the conditions develop. He wrote something else. He said, "What's your yield target?" She said, "Northfield ran 63 last year. West Quarter ran 62. I'd like to see both fields above 65. Walt looked at the stand again. He said, "What does your binder say the probability is in a year with this tiller density and this tissue profile?" She said Harlan's records in Stafford County show a yield range of 64 to 71 in years where the spring profile matches this one. His average in those years is 67.2. Walt wrote that down. He did not say anything about it. He thanked her and got in his truck and drove to the next farm on his route. On the night of May 14th, Danny knocked on Vera's bedroom door at 10:30. She was not distressed. She had the look of someone who has been sitting with a question and has decided it is time to ask it. She said, "Are we going to have to sell the farm?" Vera looked at her daughter in the doorway. She said no. Danny said, "But you don't know that yet. Not for sure." Vera was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Come sit down." Danny sat on the edge of the chair by the window. Outside, the south field was dark, under a half moon, the wheat standing in the night without moving, because there was no wind. Vera said your grandfather has been running the same management method on his ground since you were before born. In 25 years of following the tissue test data and adjusting the nitrogen timing and selecting the variety for the specific field, he has never had a year where the method produced less than the county average. Not once. Danny said, "But this isn't Stafford County." Vera said no. "But the wheat is the same. The soil class is similar. And we have been running the same method here since 1986. 10 years of data that says what this ground does when you manage it this way." Danny said, "Then why is the bank worried?" Vera said, "Because the bank doesn't have our binder. They have the county average. And the county average doesn't show what happens when you do it right." Danny looked at the south field through the window. She said so, the binder is the answer. Vera said the binder plus the harvest. You need both. The record tells you what to expect. The harvest tells you what actually happened. Danny sat there a moment longer. Then she said, "Grandpa's been checking the north field every morning before you get up." Vera said, "I know." Danny said he checked it this morning at 5:15. "I saw him from my window." Vera said, "What did he do?" Danny said he walked to the middle of the field. He stood there for a while. Then he came back. Vera looked at the ceiling for a moment. She said that means it's looking the way he expected it to look. Danny said, "How do you know?" She said, "Because if it wasn't, he would have come inside and told me." The fungicide went on in the last week of May. Pete drove the sprayer and Vera walked the field margins, checking the spray coverage and recording the application time and the wind speed and the temperature in the field log, the same entries she had been making for every input application since 1986. The application window had opened exactly when the temperature data suggested it would. The stripe rust pressure building in the flag leaf stage and the timing of the application fell inside the protection window by 4 days, which was the margin Harlan's records identified as the threshold between protecting the grain fill period and missing it. The wheat headed out in the last days of May. Vera walked the north field. On the first morning, she could see the heads fully emerged above the flag leaves, and she stood at the edge of the stand and looked at the uniformity of the emergence across the field and felt the particular knowledge. Not hope, not calculation, but knowledge of someone who has followed a process through its full sequence and is seeing the process confirm itself in the physical outcome of the standing crop. She called Harlan from the field end. He was at the house. She said, "Northfield is at full head." He said, "How does it look?" She said, "Uniform. Flag leaves are clean, Head size is consistent across the stand. He was quiet for a moment. She heard him set something down on the table. Then he said, "What does the West Quarter look like?" She said, "I'm going there next." He said, "Call me from the West Quarter." She walked the half-mile to the West Quarter and called him from the far end. She described what she saw. The head size on the West Quarter was slightly larger than the North Field on average, which was the moisture-holding ground, doing what it did when the season cooperated, putting additional grain fill into each head in the period when moisture was the limiting factor. Harlan listened to her description. She heard him breathing on the other end of the line. Then he said, "Walk back to the house." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because I'm going to tell you something when you get here that I don't want to say on the phone." She walked back across the 2 fields in the late afternoon light and came in through the back door and found Harlan sitting at the kitchen table with the 1988 Stafford County binder open to the page she had been thinking about since April. The page that showed his North Quarter in its best year, the one she had been using as the comparison benchmark. He looked at her. He said, "The West Quarter description you just gave me. Head size, moisture expression, flag leaf condition, that matches the description I wrote in this binder on May 29th, 1988. She looked at the page. He said that year came in at 71 bushels on that quarter, his best single field in his best year. She looked at him. She said, "This is not Stafford County." He said, "No. But you have 10 years of evidence that your management here tracks my Stafford County outcomes within 3 to 4 bushels in comparable weather years." He pushed the binder toward her. "What does a 3 to 4 bushel haircut on 71 give you?" She looked at the number. 67 to 68 bushels. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at Harlan. He said, "I'm not promising you anything. The weather between now and July is still the weather." She said, "I know." He said, "But that's what the records say, and the records are what we have." She closed the binder and looked at the kitchen table. Dean had sat at this table for 13 years, making the decisions that kept the Voss place going, and she had been making them for 14 months since he stopped, and Harlan had been sitting at this table since June of 1995, because he understood something about what was being built here that was larger than any single year's yield. She said, "Gerald Moss wants an answer before harvest." Harlan said, "Let him want it." Outside the wheat on the North Field and the West Quarter, and the Northwest Corner and the South Field was standing in the evening light at full. Had 60 days from the combine and the management that had been moving toward this moment since the tissue samples in April, and the nitrogen timing in February, and the variety selection in August, and the seeding rate calibration in October, and the 10 years of binder entries before all of that was now in the hands of the Kansas summer, which was the only party left with an opinion that would settle the matter. Vera looked out the window at the standing crop. Then she picked up her field notebook and made the heading date entry for the West Quarter, and below it she wrote the head size observation, and below that she wrote the comparison reference to Harlan's 1988 Stafford County entry, which was the way the record was supposed to work, each entry connecting backward to what came before it, and forward to what had not happened yet. She closed the notebook. She set it on top of the binder. She went to start supper, and through the kitchen window, the wheat stood in the last of the evening light, saying in the only language it had what it had been building toward since October. June came in dry and hot, which was the weather the wheat needed to push hard. Through the grain fill period, and the Pratt County fields tightened toward harvest with the speed that dry heat produces, the heads swelling and then hardening the color, moving from green to the particular gold that tells a person who has been watching Kansas wheat long enough that the season is done building and ready to be measured. Vera walked the fields in the evenings, not checking anymore, not counting or recording, just reading the crop in the way Harlan had taught her to read it, with the eyes of someone who has followed a process through every step and is now watching the process deliver its answer. She did not write in the field notebook in June. There was nothing left to adjust. The work was finished, and the only thing left to do was wait for the moisture to drop to harvest level and call Pete to get the 9,500 ready. Harlan walked with her some evenings. They did not talk much on those walks. He would stop at a particular head and look at it, pinching the stem between his fingers to feel the straw brittleness that indicates kernel hardness. And she would stop beside him, and they would both look at the head without speaking, and then move on. It was the kind of walking that two people do when they have said everything that needs to be said and are now simply present with the outcome of what they built together. On the last evening of June, Vera stopped at the center of the north field and looked at the stand running to the county road in one direction and to the field boundary in the other. The gold continuous and unbroken, the head density visible even at distance. She did not call Harlan over. She stood there alone for a while. She thought about Dean, who had farmed this field for 13 years and had kept the records that showed her what it could do. She thought about the binder on the kitchen table with his handwriting in the early years, and hers in the later ones, two handwritings telling the same story from different ends of the decade. She thought about the morning in May 1995 when the phone had rung and she had understood from the first word what the call was going to say. She did not stay in that thought. She looked at the crop. The crop was what remained of everything that had been decided and undecided and fought for and documented and waited on since that morning. The crop was the answer to Gerald Moss and Curtis Plank and every person who had looked at her situation in the summer of 1995 and calculated the variables without including the one variable that mattered most, which was what she knew and what she had been taught and what was recorded in green-covered binders going back to 1971. She went back to the house and told Harlan the Northfield would be ready to cut in 10 days. He said, "I'll tell Pete to start the pre-harvest check tomorrow." The John Deere 9500 came out of the machine shed on a Monday morning in the first week of July, with Pete running the pre-cut check and Cody handing tools and holding the work light in the places where the machine's interior required a second set of hands. The combine was 3 years old and had been maintained with the same discipline that Vera applied to everything else on the Voss place. The maintenance records in the same filing system as the yield binders, oil change intervals, and header adjustments, and real speed calibrations documented by season and by field. Vera ran the first test pass on the North Field on the morning of July 8th to check the moisture level and the threshing adjustment. The grain was at 13.2% moisture, which was inside the elevator's standard acceptance range, and the threshing cylinder pressure was set to the Jagger variety's recommended tolerance, which she had noted from the previous year's harvest log. She ran the pass, checked the grain loss monitor at the rear, adjusted the sieves, ran another 50-yard pass, and checked again. The machine was set right. She called Bud Fenner at the Kiowa elevator and told him she would be bringing loads starting the following morning. Bud said, "How's it looking out there?" She said, "It's looking the way the binder said it should look." He said he would have the scale house open at 6. The morning of July 14th started at 4:45, when Vera's alarm went off, and she lay in the dark for a moment, listening to the house, which was quiet, except for the sound of Harlan moving in the kitchen below, already up, already making coffee in the way he had been making it since June, an hour before anyone else needed to be awake. She dressed and came downstairs, and he set a cup in front of her, without being asked, and they both stood at the kitchen window and looked at the north field in the pre-dawn dark without speaking. At 5, the 950 O's engine turned over the diesel sound, filling the yard and traveling across the dark field, in the way that large engines travel across flat Kansas ground, carrying further than it seems like it should. Cody was on the grain cart tractor. Pete was in the field truck. Danny had her notebook and would run the load logistics from the field end, calling in the moisture readings to Vera on the radio as each tank filled. Vera climbed the combine ladder and settled into the cab and set the header height and engaged the reel drive and began the first pass of the morning. Harlan sat in the truck at the south end of the field. He did not run a radio. He sat with the window down and watched the combine's running lights move through the field in the dark, the header taking the standing crop row by row in the sound that has no equivalent in any other kind of work. The particular combination of reel and cutter bar and threshing drum that turns standing grain into measured yield in a continuous mechanical process that has been refined over a century of prairie harvest. He had heard that sound for 60 years. He sat in the truck and listened to it, and watched the lights, and did not move. The first load went to Kiowa at 6:15. Pete drove the grain cart truck, and Vera kept cutting. Bud Fenner was at the scale house when the truck pulled in, which Pete noted, because Bud would usually still pouring his coffee when the first load arrived on a harvest morning. He weighed the truck and wrote the ticket sent Pete around to the receiving pit. The second load arrived at 7:40. Bud wrote the ticket. The third load at 8:50. By the third load, Bud had started doing the per-acre math on the back of a ticket stub, estimating the tank weights against the acreage and coming up with a preliminary number that he looked at and set aside, because the number seemed outside the range of what he expected. The fourth load came in at 10:20. Bud wrote the ticket. He looked at the weight. He looked at the acreage counter Pete had written in the load log. He did the arithmetic twice, first on the stub, and then on the adding machine he kept on the scale house counter for exactly this kind of verification. He walked to the door of the scale house and looked at the John Deere truck sitting on the scale with the Voss Farm placards in the window. He looked at the number on the slip. 68 bushels per acre on the fourth load, with the first 3 loads running within 2 bushels of the same. He stood at the door for a moment. Then he went back inside and picked up the phone and called the first farmer he knew who would be in from the field by mid-morning and asked what their ground was running. 52. He called the next. 54. He called a third. 49 on his best quarter. He called the Pratt County Extension Office and left a message for Walt Deering. Back at the North Field, Vera was on the 7th pass when Danny called on the radio to say the 4th load ticket had come back with a note from Bud Fenner that she should call him when she had a moment. Vera finished the pass and pulled to the field end and called the elevator on the cab radio. Bud answered on the second ring. He read her the number. She listened to it. She said, "That's what I have on the yield monitor." Bud said, "I've been calling around this morning. Nobody in 3 counties is running above 58. She said, "I know." Bud was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your daddy there with you this morning?" She said, "He's in the truck at the south end." Bud said, "You might want to drive over and tell him the number." She said she would. She set the radio back in its bracket and sat in the cab for a moment. The north field stretched out ahead of her, 22 acres still to cut the standing grain, gold in the morning light. Behind her, the cut ground showed the clean stubble of the harvested rows uniform, in their spacing the straw lying in the even pattern of a well-adjusted machine that had been cutting the way it was supposed to cut. She engaged the header drive and made the next pass. At noon, she drove the combine to the field end and got out and walked to Harlan's truck. He was still sitting in the same position he had been in since before dawn, both hands on the steering wheel looking at the field. He had not run the engine. He had not gotten out. He had just sat in the truck and watched. She came to the driver's side window. He looked at her. She said, "Bud Fenner has 68 on the north field." Harlan looked at her. He did not say anything for a moment. He looked back at the field. The cut half showed the stubble, and the uncut half showed the standing grain, and the line between them was straight in the way that a well-run combine leaves things straight, which is a kind of order that only exists as the result of care applied, consistently across a long sequence of decisions. He said, "That's a good crop." She said, "I know." He got out of the truck. He was 67 years old and moved the way men move at 67 when they have been sitting for 6 hours carefully and without haste. He looked at the field. He put his hand on the door of the combine, the same gesture she had seen him make at the end of every harvest day in Stafford County when she was a child, a hand on the machine that had done the work, a brief acknowledgement before moving to the next thing. He said, "What does the West Quarter look like?" She said, "We start it tomorrow morning." He said, "Good." He got back in the truck. She climbed back up the combine ladder and engaged the header drive and made the next pass. The West Quarter came in at 69.3. The Northwest corner, the sandier ground she had seeded at the higher rate and corrected the sulfur deficiency on in April, came in at 64, which was 3 bushels above its 10-year average on the place, and which was the sulfur correction doing exactly what Harlan's records said micronutrient corrections did on ground that had a documented deficiency. The South Field ran 66. The farm average across all 400 acres when Pete added the final numbers on the evening of the third harvest day was 67.1 bushels per acre. Harlan's 25-year average in comparable weather years in Stafford County was 67.2. Pete wrote the number on the harvest log sheet and set it on the kitchen table next to the binder and did not say anything. He had been on the Voss place for 6 years and had watched the management year by year and understood in the way of a man who does good work without making speeches about it what the number represented and what it had taken to get there. He set the log sheet down and went to clean the combine for storage. Danny looked at the harvest log from across the table. She said, "That's the number." Vera said, "That's the number." Danny picked up the log sheet and looked at it for a moment. Then she set it on top of Harlan's 1988 binder, the one that showed his best Stafford County year. She said, "They're the same," Vera said within a tenth. Danny looked at the 2 documents, the harvest log and the binder, sitting on top of each other on the kitchen table. She said, "Is this what you knew was going to happen?" Vera looked at her daughter. She said, "It's what the records said should happen." Knowing it was going to happen and having the records say it should happen are different things. The records were right. I didn't know they would be until Bud called on the 4th load. Danny said, "But you didn't sign the bank's paper." Vera said no. Danny said, "Because of the records." Vera said, "Because of the records, and because your grandfather has been doing this for 25 years, and in 25 years the method has never produced less than the county average when it was applied correctly. That is a fact. It is in the binders. You can read it yourself." Danny was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want to start my own binder." Vera looked at her. She said, "Your grandfather started his when he was 42. You're 14, Danny said. Then I'll have 28 more years of data than he had when he started." Vera did not say anything for a moment. Then she went to the shelf above the counter where the farm supplies were kept and took down a new 3-ring binder green cover, which was the color she had been using since she started her own records in 1986, and set it on the table in front of Danny. The news moved through Pratt County in the way that harvest numbers move through a farming community, fast and specific, carrying the particular weight that attaches to a number nobody has seen before in a context where everyone understands what the number means. Bud Fenner had mentioned it to 6 farmers by mid-morning of the 14th. By afternoon, it had reached the co-op in Pratt. By evening, the Farm Credit Office in Pratt had a version of it passed along by a farmer who banked there and who had heard it at the elevator. Curtis Plank heard the number from his neighbor on the afternoon of July 14th. The same afternoon, Vera was cutting the last of the north field. He drove his pickup to the section boundary between his ground and the Voss north field and parked on the shoulder and looked at the stubble on her side of the fence. His own best field that year was running 54. He had been in Pratt County long enough and had farmed long enough to read what 68 bushels per acre on that ground said about how the ground had been managed, and what it said was not a comfortable thing to sit with in a truck on a county road on a July afternoon, when you had spent the better part of 14 months telling a widow that her operation was more than she could handle. He sat in the truck for a while. Then he drove to Pratt. He did not go to the co-op. He drove to the extension office and parked and went inside and asked the receptionist for Walt Deering. Walt came out. Curtis told him he had heard about the Voss yield numbers and wanted to know where to start if he was interested in changing his fertilizer management approach. He did not mention the co-op conversation from the previous fall. He did not mention the visits to the Voss place or the offer on the West 120 or what he had said to Pete Schiller. He asked about tissue testing and about variable nitrogen timing and about whether the extension office had any materials on the approach. Walt gave him the packet. Curtis thanked him and left. Walt called Vera that evening and told her about the visit. He said he had not told Curtis anything about the Voss records or the management history. He said he had given him the standard extension materials on precision fertility management. Vera said that's fine. Walt said he didn't mention talking to you. She said I didn't expect him to. Walt said I'm going to write up the Voss farm results for the county newsletter, not as a record, because I haven't done the historical legwork to use that word responsibly, but as a significantly above-average outcome with documented management practices attached. I'd like to use your yield data and your binder methodology if you'll let me. She said use whatever helps people understand what's in the binders. He came out to the farm 2 days later and spent 3 hours going through the binder with Vera and Harlan at the kitchen table asking questions about the tissue test protocol and the nitrogen timing logic and the variety selection process and the seeding rate calibration. He was the kind of man who wrote down what he was told and then asked the follow-up question that showed he had understood what he wrote down, and at the end of 3 hours, he had 12 pages of notes and had asked Harlan 3 questions that Harlan had not been asked in 25 years of doing this work in Stafford County. Harlan answered each question fully. He was not a man who withheld information from someone who was asking the right questions. After Walt left, Harlan sat at the table with his coffee and looked at the binders for a while. He said he's going to change some things in this county. Vera said, probably. He said, good. Gerald Moss called on the Monday morning following the harvest completion. His voice had a different quality than it had carried in the March phone call, a careful quality, the voice of a man who is revising a position and wants to do it without calling the revision what it is. He said the bank had received the harvest yield reports from the county elevator and wanted to schedule a meeting to discuss the loan account status. She said she would come in on Wednesday morning. She drove to Pratt on Wednesday with both binders in the passenger seat, her own and Harlan's 1971 to 1996 volume, and parked in the farm credit lot and carried them inside and set them on Gerald Moss's desk before she sat down. Gerald looked at the binders. He looked at Vera. He said the farm's harvest performance had exceeded the bank's projection by a significant margin, and that the account's debt service capacity was clearly sufficient to cover the outstanding note. She said the account's debt service capacity is the same capacity it had in March when you sent the restructuring letter. The only thing that changed between March and now is that you have the actual yield numbers instead of the county average. He said the county average is the standard methodology for agricultural lending assessments. She said, I understand that. And I'm telling you, it produced an inaccurate picture of this farm's productivity, because this farm's management history is documented above county average consistently across 10 years. She put her hand on the binders. The 10-year record is here. My father's 25-year record is here beside it. You could have requested these records in June of 1995 when you took over this account. They were available. Gerald looked at the binders. He did not open them. He said we'd like to discuss a refinancing arrangement for the outstanding principal that takes into account the farm's demonstrated productivity. She said, I'm not interested in refinancing. I'm interested in retiring the note. He said the current terms required a balloon payment that would not be due for 4 more years, and that the bank could offer favorable refinancing that reduced the annual payment burden while extending the term. She said, what is the payoff figure on the current note? He told her the number. She set a check on his desk. She had prepared it that morning after calling the elevator for the final settlement figure on the harvest proceeds. The check covered the full outstanding principal and the current interest to date. Gerald looked at the check. He picked it up and looked at it for a moment. He set it down. She said, I'd like a letter confirming the note is retired and the lien on the West 120 is released. He said he would have it prepared by the end of the week. She said, I'll wait. He looked at her. He said, Mrs. Voss. She said, I'll wait for the letter. Gerald Moss stood up and went to the processing desk and spoke to his assistant, and came back 15 minutes later with a letter on farm credit letterhead confirming the retirement of the note and the release of the collateral lien. He set it on the desk in front of her. She read it. She folded it and put it in her jacket pocket. She picked up both binders from his desk and stood up. She said, the next time you take over an agricultural account with a management history on file, request the binders before you write the appraisal. She picked up her keys and walked out. She sat in the truck in the farm credit parking lot for a moment, with the binders on the passenger seat and the letter in her jacket pocket. The July sun was at the angle it reaches in mid-morning. In Kansas already hard and direct, the parking lot empty, except for 2 other vehicles and the shadow of the building falling straight down from the roof edge. She thought about Gerald's face when she set the check on his desk, the specific expression of a man who has underestimated a variable and is in the process of recalculating. She started the truck and drove home on the county roads. Harlan was on the porch when she pulled in. He had his coffee and the look of a man who has been waiting in the particular way of someone who knows what the news is likely to be, but wants to hear it said. She got out and came up the porch steps and sat in the other chair. He said, how did it go? She said, the note is retired. The lien on the West 120 is released. He looked at the road for a moment. Then he looked at his coffee cup. He said Dean would be glad of that. She said, I know. They sat on the porch for a while. The north field was visible from the porch, the stubble gold in the morning light clean, and even the harvest done. The west quarter was behind the machine shed, and the south field was across the county road. All of them stubble now, all of them finished the season complete. Harlan set his coffee cup on the porch rail. He said, I'm going to drive back to Stafford County this week. She said, I know. He said, Iris has been patient. She said she has. He was quiet for a moment. He said, you don't need me here anymore. You haven't needed me here since February, if I'm honest. But I wanted to see the numbers come in. She looked at the north field. She said, I needed you here in October. I needed the binders in March. And I needed you to tell me in May what the west quarter head size meant. He said, that's true. She said, and I needed you to be in that truck at the south end on the morning of the 14th. He looked at her. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the field. He said, yes. That too. They sat until his coffee was finished. Then he stood up and went inside to pack his bag. Pete came in from the shop that afternoon and found Danny at the kitchen table with the new green binder open in front of her, writing in it, in the same precise hand she had been developing since October. She had divided the first page into the column format that Vera used. Field sections across the top, years down the left margin, with a row for each input and observation at the bottom of the page. She was writing the 1996 harvest numbers in the first column. 68 on the north field, 69.3 on the west quarter, 64 on the northwest corner, 66 on the south field, farm average 67.1. Pete looked at the page over her shoulder. He said, "You're starting with this year." She said, "You have to start somewhere." He said, "Your grandfather started in 1971. She said, "Then, by the time I'm his age, I'll have 40 more years of data than he had." Pete looked at the page for a moment. He said, "What are you putting in the notes column?" She showed him. She had written, "First full year under my observation. Management consistent with prior years per mother's records. Yield above county average by 15 to 16. Bushels across all fields. Sulfur application on northwest corner, April 22nd. Response, confirmed at harvest. See mother's binder, 1986 to 1996, and grandfather's binder, 1971 to 1996, for management history." Pete read it twice. He said, "That's a complete first entry." She said, "That's how you start a record," Grandpa told me. Harlan left on a Thursday morning, the duffel bag in the truck bed. The coffee finished the yard quiet in the early light. He had said his goodbyes to Cody the night before, and to Pete, who had shaken his hand at the equipment shed with the respect of one working man for another working man who has done good work. Danny had given him a copy of her first binder entry, written out neatly on a piece of notebook paper, and he had folded it and put it in his shirt pocket and not said anything about it. Vera walked him to the truck. He put the bag in the bed and opened the driver's door and stood with his hand on the door frame and looked at the farm, the fields and the buildings and the machine shed, and the north field stubble visible over the equipment yard fence. He said, "You built something here. You and Dean built it, and you carried it through, and the numbers came in the way the method said they should come in." She said, "The numbers came in the way your method said they should come in. It's the same method." He looked at her. He said, "It's your method now. It's been your method since you were 17 years old in Stafford County running the fertilizer calculations. I just wrote it down first." She said, "You wrote it down so it could be handed forward." He said, "Yes." She said, "It's been handed forward." He got in the truck. He did not look back as he drove down the lane, which was how he always left a place when the leaving was a good leaving, and there was nothing more to say. She watched the truck turn onto the county road and head west toward Stafford County, carrying 67 years of a man who had spent 40 of them paying attention to the same ground, until the attention became a record, and the record became a method, and the method became something his daughter had carried to different ground in different weather, and the ground had answered. The binders were on the kitchen table. Harlan's 25 years and Vera's 10 years and Danny's first page 3 green covers in a row, the column entries running across decades of Stafford County and Pratt County, ground in 2 handwritings and now a third. The north field in the morning light was stubble and silence. In October, it would be planted again, the same variety selection process, the same seeding rate calibration, the same tissue test protocol in April, the same nitrogen timing, the same disease scouting, the same harvest log entry at the end. The method did not change because the season changed. The method was the thing that remained constant while the seasons varied around it, which was the only way to build a record that meant something over time. Gerald Moss did not call again that summer. Curtis Plank did not come by. The farm credit lien on the West 120 was released on a Thursday and recorded at the county clerk's office on a Friday, which was a matter of public record in Pratt County, and which several people noticed without saying anything about it to Vera directly, which was fine, because she had not needed anyone to say anything about it. The binders were what remained, the land and the records, and the method, and the work that never announced itself until the numbers came in, and the numbers said what 40 years of careful attention had been building toward. The wheat did not know it had been doubted. It only knew the soil temperature, and the nitrogen, and the moisture, and the management that had met each of those things in the right sequence at the right time, the way Harlan had met them in Stafford County, and the way Vera had met them here field by field, year by year, with the record kept, and the method trusted and the harvest waited on, with the particular patience of people who have done the work correctly and know what correctly done work produces. It produces what the binder says it should produce, no more and never less.